What if a single grudge could change an entire life? When a child's heartache twists into a thirst for revenge, it doesn't just end with hatred. It seeps into the very fabric of her soul, reshaping everything she touches. Today, a long-buried secret is about to be unveiled, one that has been hidden beneath the smile of a woman who seemed to have it all. A story where love turns to resentment, and revenge becomes its own prison. This isn't just the tale of one woman. It's the story of anyone who's ever let their struggles define their fate. Are you ready to unravel the darkest secrets of this tale? Or will it consume you in the shadows? The mournful toll of church bells rolled through the sleepy village of Elmridge like thunder wrapped in velvet, each chime a slow, deliberate echo reverberating across slate rooftops, down lichen-streaked alleyways, and through time-worn shutters that twitched as unseen eyes peered out with a mixture of dread and insatiable curiosity. The mist clung low to the earth, curling like breath from the mouths of ghosts, as if the very air knew that this day bore something darker than mere sorrow. Miss Elowen Gray, elegant and unnervingly composed, made her way along the winding cobbled path to St. Bartholomew's Church, her boots clicking softly with each step, her long black coat brushing her calves like the trailing hem of a shadow. She paused briefly at the iron gate, adjusting her gloves with surgical precision, her gaze sweeping the scene with the quiet calculation of someone who had learned to read between words, beneath gestures and behind faces. This wasn't just any funeral. This was her funeral, the one the village had been whispering about for weeks in kitchens, under hedgerows, in the pews of churches and the aisles of shops. The funeral of Evelyn Harrow's third husband. The woman they now called the Widow of Three stood poised in the churchyard, her figure as statuesque as a mourner carved in stone, the black silk of her mourning veil whispering in the wind like secrets in motion. Her face was mostly hidden, but her posture spoke volumes. Back straight, chin lifted, shoulders squared not with grief, but with the haunting confidence of someone rehearsed in ritual. Around her, villagers gathered in stiff clusters, their murmurs held in check by propriety but buzzing just beneath the surface like a swarm behind glass. Miss Elowen moved among them silently, her presence unnoticed by most, yet her mind catching every tremor, every nervous laugh too quick, every sympathetic word that tasted forced, every glance that lingered too long on Evelyn Harrow's unflinching form. Inside the stone nave, where candlelight flickered against stained glass and the chill crept in through centuries-old mortar, the funeral began. But for Elowen, the real ceremony was not the one led by hymns and hollow prayers. It was in the way eyes darted during eulogies, how people avoided saying the husband's name too often, how Reverend Alden's voice faltered at the line, "A man taken too soon by tragic chance." 3 husbands, each claimed by fate in curiously tidy intervals. The first, Thomas, trampled by a horse he'd raised from a foal, yet known across counties for his unmatched skill with beasts. The second, Julian, dead by a fever that left no trace, no warning and no explanation. And the third, poor Martin, found crumpled at the foot of his staircase, his neck broken, his slippers perfectly aligned at the top step, as though someone had helped him out of them before the fall. Afterward, at the vicarage, the air turned thick with the scent of chamomile tea and social tension. Plates of cucumber sandwiches and crumbling seed cake sat mostly untouched, as the real appetite among the guests was for speculation, not sustenance. "She's cursed," someone whispered, their voice thick with awe and fear. "No," came the hushed reply, sharper, colder. "She's a black widow." Conversations fluttered like moths, some dancing close to the flame, others keeping just enough distance to feign innocence. Miss Elowen sat quietly near the window, sipping lukewarm tea, her eyes half-lidded, but her thoughts spiraling inward, drawing threads together like a spider rebuilding a torn web. Gossip was often absurd, frequently cruel, but it always contained flecks of something real. And when old Reverend Alden approached, his voice warm, his tone casual, she caught it, the slip, the fracture in the surface. "Terrible shame about Thomas," he said. "Such a fine horseman. Never took a bad fall in his life. Not until that day." Elowen's expression didn't change, but her heart beat once, slow and deep like a drum of revelation. That wasn't a detail a reverend would normally emphasize, not unless he'd thought about it, not unless he too had questions. Unspoken, buried beneath tradition and politeness. Her gaze drifted outside, where Widow Harrow stood alone by the gate, the veil now lifted slightly, her eyes scanning the horizon not with sorrow, but something else, watchfulness, calculation, a sense of control so absolute it made Eloan's spine stiffen. This woman wasn't grieving. She was surviving, again, and in a village like Elmridge, where nothing stayed buried forever, not even the dead. The past had a way of clawing its way back to the surface. Miss Eloan knew one thing with grim certainty. This was no longer about coincidence or curses. This was about patterns, and patterns always led somewhere, usually to the truth. The morning in Greystone Hollow crept in slow and silent, heavy with a mist that clung to gravestones like secrets to a conscience, refusing to lift even as the church bell tolled its final chime. The village, old and rooted in its traditions, bore the kind of hush that comes not from peace but from the weight of things unspoken. It was the funeral of Aldrich Blythe, the third husband of the ever-enigmatic Isadora, and though the chapel pews were modestly filled, the real congregation was the village itself, watching from behind twitching curtains and half-closed shutters, speaking in murmurs over kettle whistles and clinking teacups. And there at the edge of it all, just beyond the tangled vines of St. Jude's old stone wall, stood Miss Henrietta Vale, a visitor from London known among the discreet for her quiet genius in seeing what others dared not. Her gaze, cold and unblinking, was not fixed on the grieving widow draped in flowing black, but on the trio of gravestones lined up beneath the chapel's eastern yew, so precisely placed they seemed less a consequence of fate, and more the result of intention. Each stone bore the surname Blythe, each inscribed in a script too elegant for coincidence, and each detailing a tragedy stranger than the last. The first, a celebrated novelist with a penchant for antique ink, had been found amid a sudden blaze that devoured only his writing room, though oddly, the rest of the manor remained untouched. The second, a botanist with no known ailments, had drowned in the shallow garden pond, his hands stained with petals, his lungs with water, and his expression eerily serene. The third, Aldrich, a retired judge with a reputation for harsh sentences, had simply failed to wake one morning, despite being in perfect health the evening before. No cause was ever found, but no further questions were asked either, at least not out loud. Henrietta had seen this before, not in village graveyards, but in ledgers, testimonies, and the way silence echoes when shaped carefully by someone with a motive. And the silence here was thick, suspiciously so. Around her, villagers talked in tones too careful, stories repeated with the same words, the same pauses, like lines rehearsed for a play. No one admitted was being performed. Old Mr. Darrington, leaning on his warped cane, spoke of Aldrich's final sermon with a kind of reverence that didn't quite mask his relief. Clara Reed, the baker with the knowing eyes, lowered her voice to say, Isadora always bought too much laudanum, and never for herself. Even the gravedigger, usually drunk by noon, worked with uncharacteristic precision, as if afraid to dig too deep. Then there was the Reverend Father Merriweather, his fingers fumbling over his stole, his voice roughened not by age, but something closer to unease, who leaned toward Henrietta, and whispered words that lingered like frostbite. 3 men don't die that cleanly, that quietly, unless someone wants them to. Henrietta didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes followed Isadora as she drifted from the graveside, her veil catching in the wind, revealing a face untouched by tears, and eyes sharp as winter glass. Isadora did not walk like a woman burdened by grief, but like one rehearsing her next scene. And beside her, just a step behind, was a new figure, tall, smiling, and clearly besotted, a newcomer, a suitor. The fourth, his name was Thomas Everley, an architect from the city, with dreams of country life, and no idea what stories these graves truly told. Henrietta's breath stilled. The pattern was repeating, the timing, the charm, the calculated way. Isadora folded her gloved hand over Thomas's arm, gentle, guiding, like a spider coaxing a fly, just a little further into the web. Henrietta had come to Greystone Hollow on a hunch, but now she stayed on instinct. Something was unfolding here, not just a string of tragedies, but a design, like a novel being written in gravestones. She would not interfere yet. No, not until she knew what ink the next chapter would be written in: blood, poison, or something far colder. As the wind stirred the ivy, and the chapel bell groaned one final note, Henrietta turned from the graves, her footsteps deliberate, already plotting her way closer to the widow's next move. The village might still believe in coincidence, but she knew better. Patterns always meant something, and in Greystone Hollow, something wicked was being written with elegant precision, and she intended to read every line before it ended in another grave. The village of Elmridge had always breathed in whispers, as though every brick and cobblestone had secrets pressed into its cracks, secrets that watched, waited, and remembered. Beneath the withering gaze of its ancient oaks and time-worn chimneys, a pattern had begun to weave itself into the very bones of the town. 3 husbands, 3 funerals, and now a suitor stepping, unknowingly, into the fading shadow of the last burial bell. He walked with the careless confidence of someone in love, a man blissfully ignorant of the history, stretching behind the widow, whose presence seemed to slow the air around her, like gravity itself bent to her sorrow-soaked elegance. There was a hush in Elmridge not born of reverence, but of quiet foreboding, as if fate had already penned the next chapter, and simply awaited the moment to turn the page. Miss Alara Quinn, seated at the edge of the churchyard beneath a crumbling angel statue, watched with unblinking precision, her mind threading through the pattern, not as a skeptic, but as a collector of truths too sharp for polite company. The gate creaked behind her, the sound too deliberate to be chance, like the final punctuation of a story not yet concluded. There was something almost theatrical in how perfectly the tragedies aligned, each death unexpected, neatly wrapped in the kind of accidents that demanded no further inquiry, and each man bound not only by marriage, but by the same woman who never wept too long, nor wore mourning past its fashion. The first, a naval officer, had drowned during a quiet holiday on the lake, his body found floating beside an overturned boat, though the weather had been still, and the widow unscathed. The second, a scholar of rare manuscripts, had perished in a fire that destroyed only the wing of the house containing his study. The blaze snuffed out before it could spread, yet his charred journals hinted at discoveries that might have been inconvenient. The third, a physician with an unblemished reputation, simply collapsed mid-conversation during supper, his wine untouched but his pulse gone before his fork hit the floor. And now, the fourth, Mr. Jonah Hale, a widowed clockmaker with a gentle demeanor and a naive heart, was walking straight into the heart of a storm he hadn't yet seen darkening above him. The villagers called it coincidence, muttered about cursed luck, but never too loudly, for fear the walls would listen. Yet Miss Quinn had seen this kind of design before, in old court files, in forgotten journals, in the eyes of women who had learned long ago that survival sometimes required silence and calculation. She remembered the wedding, the first one, where the bride's smile flickered for a heartbeat as the priest spoke of obedience, and how the groom's brother, pale and speechless, had left abruptly after the vows. It was then the seed of suspicion first took root. Years later, it bloomed with every obituary that arrived cloaked in civility, but stained with something colder. Alara's investigations had been slow, deliberate, masked by innocuous questions posed under the guise of genealogical research or idle conversation. She visited the old groundskeeper, who'd once sworn he'd seen a figure slip from the manor garden hours before the fire, the housemaid who remembered her master drinking only tea the night he died, not wine, and the vicar who had presided over 3 eulogies too similar in tone, and too devoid of emotion. But it was a detail whispered by the apothecary's apprentice, a bottle ordered monthly, under a false name, containing just enough laudanum to calm a heart, or stop one, that hardened her suspicion into belief. And now, as the widow strolled along the cobbled path with Mr. Hale, her fingers brushing his arm with the grace of inevitability. Alara saw the fourth headstone already forming in her mind, not because she wished it, but because patterns rarely broke themselves. Behind her, the wind rustled the dying leaves, the air thick with the quiet certainty that history was preparing to repeat itself. And Alara, with her sharp gaze and steady hand, was ready to intercept the ink before it dried, before another man became a line in the village ledger, and a whispered ghost in a house where sorrow was always too neat to be real. The air in the village carried a peculiar stillness, one that didn't come with peace, but with secrets buried deep beneath layers of time, shame and silence. It was the kind of hush that settles when people know too much but speak too little, because even a whisper could shift the delicate balance of appearances. As the sun drooped low against the horizon, Miss Hargrove walked slowly along the overgrown path toward the old cemetery, each step careful, deliberate, as if she were retracing the final moments of a story no one dared to finish. 3 graves stood in a perfect line, their stones worn but upright, silent witnesses to what the village still called tragedies. But it was the empty patch of earth beside them that chilled her most, a hollow space, waiting, as if fate had already chosen its next tenant. The woman at the center of it all was Celia Bramwell, always poised, always gracious, her lips curled in the kind of smile that never quite touched her eyes. She had a softness about her that people mistook for warmth, but Miss Hargrove had long sensed something colder beneath, something that ticked like a quiet clock, precise, patient, and fatal. Her first husband, Gregory Bramwell, had been a shy historian, a man more comfortable among books than people. He died beneath a chandelier in the library of an old manor house. A freak accident, they'd said. But Miss Hargrove had visited that library once. The ceiling was high, the fixture heavy, and the bolts loosened. No one saw it happen, but the village cat cried all night, until the caretaker found Gregory's broken body. People grieved, offered casseroles, and moved on. Her second husband, Charles Everleigh, was a prominent banker with a sharp mind and deeper pockets. Their marriage was quiet, more practical than passionate, but no one questioned it. Not until Charles drowned during a weekend boating trip. The coroner labeled it an unfortunate accident. But Miss Hargrove remembered the dock worker mentioning how one of the boat's support beams had a small jagged split, exactly where it would give way under pressure. Too deliberate to be time-worn, too precise to be natural. Her third husband, Dr. Henry Morton, was a psychologist, known for his calm voice and uncanny insight. He had helped many in the village through grief and confusion, but his own death was explained away as an accidental overdose. Still, there were questions. That night, a sudden electrical storm had knocked out power across town. Yet somehow, the clinic's refrigeration systems, which stored Henry's medications, continued working without a glitch. The dosage that killed him was significantly higher than what he'd been prescribed, and the bottle had no signs of tampering. Miss Hargrove read the autopsy twice, and knew this was no mistake. Each death was clean, unprovable, and perfectly timed, as if orchestrated by someone who understood not just the mechanics of murder, but the rhythm of grief. Now the village buzzed softly with a new story, one that began the day Reverend Ashcroft arrived. Young, idealistic, and determined to reform the old parish. He spoke of renewal and change. He had no idea what kind of ground he was stepping on, nor whose secrets he might accidentally unearth. Celia was often seen near the church, offering help with a gentle touch, and that ever-serene smile. But Miss Hargrove watched from afar, her instincts coiled like a spring. There was something rehearsed in the way Celia spoke, something deliberate in her kindness, as if she were once again preparing, planting, waiting. 3 men dead, 3 perfectly tied tragedies, and now, a 4th chapter seemed to be writing itself quietly beneath everyone's gaze. Miss Hargrove knew what most did not. Coincidence might explain one misfortune, even 2, but 4 was something else entirely. 4 was a pattern, And patterns, no matter how carefully disguised, always reveal the hand that drew them. The village of Elmridge had always worn its charm like a well-pressed coat, polished, proper, and pristine on the outside, but hiding the moth-eaten threads of old secrets beneath. It was a place where time seemed to move slower, where everyone knew everyone else's routines better than their own, and where a single whisper could curdle the morning milk. When Professor Alaric Winthrop was found dead at the foot of his grand staircase during a violent storm, the village clucked its collective tongue, and accepted the verdict of accident without question. A misstep in the dark, said the doctor. A tragic fall, said the constable. But Miss Elspeth Harrow, though long retired from any official sleuthing, still carried the sharp instincts of someone who had spent a lifetime studying the frailty of human truth, and she knew at once that something was wrong, not because of what was there, but because of what was missing. Evelyn Winthrop, the professor's younger, elegant widow, had claimed a headache that night, and remained in her room, the tray of tea she'd requested returned untouched, her door reportedly locked from within. Yet the maid had noticed no bell had been rung, no sounds of discomfort, and curiously, the fire in the widow's hearth had been recently stoked, odd for someone supposedly resting in the dark. Between the quiet retreat to her room, and the sudden arrival of guests later that evening, there was a gap, 30 minutes unaccounted for. No one questioned it, but Miss Harrow saw it clearly, a sliver of time wide enough to commit a perfect crime. The professor's body lay in a twisted sprawl, his neck snapped, his spectacles thrown several feet away, as if struck mid-motion. A single step on the staircase had been subtly loosened, just enough to give way under weight, but not enough to betray tampering to the casual eye. The storm had done its part, cloaking all in wind and darkness, erasing footsteps, muffling cries. Evelyn's alibi was too polished, too rehearsed, like a stage actor repeating lines, rather than a grieving wife recounting chaos. And that's when Miss Harrow's suspicions deepened. She began speaking with those who had been closest to the Winthrops, starting with Mrs. Linton, the housekeeper, an observant woman who knew when to keep her tongue, and when to let it slip. They argued. Often she had murmured while folding linen, not shouting. No, never shouting. It was the quiet kind, the kind that builds up like thunder behind clouds. The source of the tension, money. The professor was methodical and tight-fisted, obsessed with order and savings. Evelyn, accustomed to luxury from her previous marriage, grew frustrated, angry. Bills were left out, perhaps as warnings. New gowns arrived despite protests, travel plans made, and then abruptly cancelled. But it was not just Evelyn who had reason to feel trapped. Miss Harrow had discovered that the professor had recently altered his will, a fact unknown to all but one solicitor, whose records were destroyed in a mysterious office fire just weeks before the professor's death. The original beneficiary, not Evelyn, but someone else entirely, someone with more to gain from his demise than anyone had suspected. Could it be that Evelyn was merely the obvious suspect, painted guilty by design? The unspoken feud, the staged indifference, the missing half-hour, all pieces placed deliberately to ensure the eye never strayed beyond the widow's pale hands. And then there was the note, found half-crumpled in the professor's study, library. 9 p.m. Come alone. It was unsigned. No one had spoken of it. The constable had dismissed it as unrelated. But Miss Harrow knew better. She knew that real killers didn't always wear malice on their faces. They hid in plain sight, behind kindness, behind silence, behind carefully crafted chaos. Someone had used the storm, the darkness, and a crumbling marriage as their tools. They had orchestrated a moment so convincingly tragic that no one dared look deeper. But she would, because this wasn't just the story of a man who fell. It was the unraveling of something far older, far more dangerous. A game of deception, of carefully layered truths and well-placed lies. And Miss Harrow, with her delicate gloves and ever-watchful eyes, had just picked up the first thread. It was the sort of death that wore the perfect disguise, unassuming, almost too ordinary, like a curtain drawn just wide enough to conceal a much darker scene behind it. Everyone in Hailwick whispered that Dr. Lennox's fall down the spiral staircase during the midnight storm was nothing but misfortune. After all, the man had been seen sipping brandy earlier, had a known heart condition, and the ancient estate was notorious for its slick floors and treacherous steps during the rain. But to Clara Devon, retired librarian, sharp observer of the human soul, and a woman far more perceptive than she let on, it didn't feel like misfortune at all. It felt rehearsed. Dr. Lennox had been a meticulous man, precise in everything from his breakfast routine to the temperature of his tea. He wouldn't have wandered down a darkened corridor without his cane, and certainly not in socks. His wife, Lillian Lennox, the ever graceful and freshly widowed, wept as expected, wore black as expected, and accepted condolences with a composure that was perhaps just a touch too seamless. Within days, her creditors, once pounding at the door, vanished like mist. The doctor's insurance, Clara learned through a chance conversation with the postmaster, had been revised only weeks prior to include a clause that tripled the payout in case of accidental death. Oddly timed, suspiciously perfect. And Clara had read enough detective novels and village memoirs to know that when grief was followed too swiftly by prosperity, there was always more beneath the surface. Lillian had been married twice before, both times to older, wealthier men who had died within 5 years of the vows, their demises surrounded by storms, silence, and sudden fortune. But it wasn't just the pattern of the past. It was the arrival of a new variable that truly cracked the case wide open. A stranger, lean and impeccably dressed, arrived in town just 9 days after the funeral. He claimed to be a distant cousin, there to support family. But Clara saw through his story like a smudged windowpane. The way he looked at the house, not with nostalgia, but calculation. The way his hand lingered on Lillian's as they spoke, not with comfort, but control. And most damning of all, the envelope he dropped when he exited the cafe in haste. A letter addressed to Lillian, signed not with a name, but with a drawing. A snake devouring its tail. It was not grief Lillian wore, but a performance so polished it gleamed. Clara, who had long ago stopped believing in coincidences, saw the trap laid out before her, each step placed with deadly precision. This was not the tale of a grieving widow, but of a woman entangled in a game far older than marriage, one of power, manipulation, and perfectly timed exits. Yet, for the first time, Clara suspected Lillian was not the master of the board, but a piece moving under someone else's hand. The question that remained, chilling and sharp as the wind through the ivy, who was next? Because in a village like Hailwick, patterns did not end. They repeated again and again, until someone brave enough dared to shatter them. Devlin Thorne's arrival didn't so much disturb the village as it unsettled it, like a draft slipping through a tightly shut window, unnoticed at first, but impossible to ignore once it's crept in. He stepped off the hired carriage just after sunrise, dressed in an immaculately cut coat that bore no sign of travel dust, with boots that clicked sharply against the cobbles, as though announcing not just his presence, but his intention. Even the horses seemed to shudder as he passed them, as if they sensed something unnatural beneath his stillness. The widow Albridge stood waiting, a little too ready, as though she'd anticipated his precise hour of arrival. Not a minute early, not a second late. Her smile was delicate, rehearsed, and the glint in her eyes carried more caution than delight, like a woman trying to remember a script she didn't write. He bowed with perfect elegance, offered her a single white rose, an unusual gesture, not quite mourning, not quite romantic, more ceremonial, as if marking the beginning of something solemn yet deliberate. Within minutes, he was inside Trevelyan House, where silence had hung for weeks like a heavy curtain, a silence too obedient to be natural. Miss Halbram, who had lived through 2 wars and 3 scandals without blinking, watched it all from behind her lace-draped window, her breath fogging the glass just slightly. It wasn't just the man's sudden presence that alarmed her. It was his poise, the mechanical precision in his charm, the way he surveyed the house as though cataloguing its vulnerabilities. He didn't look at the widow with affection. He looked at the beams, the locks, the hinges, the windows that stuck in their frames, even the slight dip in the roofline, as if assessing a structure he intended to enter, not inhabit. His gaze was the kind that didn't merely observe, it measured, weighed, calculated, like someone who wasn't discovering the house for the first time, but confirming what he already knew. Within hours, whispers began like wind through the tall grass. Was he a secret lover returned from exile, a long-lost heir, a relative with claims, or something more elusive, an orchestrator, a man who arrives not to mourn or love, but to reshape fates from within? While some leaned toward scandal, and others toward hope, Miss Halbram saw only the dangerous calm of a man who had studied this role before stepping into it. She had witnessed such men before, men who walked into rooms and rewrote their history with nothing but a smile, and a motive buried just deep enough to escape casual notice. But what chilled her more was the widow's response, not flustered, not skeptical, but open, expectant, almost as though she'd been waiting for the storm to knock, as though she wasn't surprised by his arrival, but relieved. That night, rain whispered secrets down her windows, the kind of rain that felt like it had purpose. Miss Halbram sat beneath a single gas lamp thumbing through an old journal of village events, noted deaths, inheritances, visitors whose names had long since faded, yet whose timing had left scars. The margins were filled with her own annotations, arrows, dates, circled names. The patterns were there, not just in ink but in silence. Too many sudden suitors, too many quiet funerals, too many wealthy women left in empty houses, their legacies absorbed into fog and ivy. The glove she'd found near the widow's gate, soft leather, bespoke with an insignia no common man could afford, still lay in her drawer. No man left such a clue by accident. It was a breadcrumb, or perhaps bait, a signature disguised as coincidence. And in villages like theirs, people rarely tripped over the truth. They were led there, step by delicate step, by men who knew exactly where the truth would bruise the hardest. The next morning, with rain still clinging to the hedges, and the sky wearing a grey so heavy it bent the light, Miss Halbram wrapped her shawl tight and approached Trevelyan House not as a neighbor, but as a watchful guardian of truths too long buried. In her basket, a jar of damson jam, in her heart the quiet dread of a woman who understood that danger often knocks dressed as deliverance, and that the most dangerous man is not the one who wants your fortune, but the one who already knows how you'll surrender it. The path to the door was lined with crushed petals, rose petals, white, like the one he had offered. She bent down and touched one. Still damp, still fresh. She straightened, knocked twice, and waited, not for an answer, but for a revelation. Because sometimes, when you stare long enough into a mystery, it doesn't dissolve. It stares back. The widow Elowyn Blythe's parlor, with its soft velvet drapes and faint scent of lavender and lemon polish, was an atmosphere of serenity, a sanctuary that invited conversation. But beneath its delicate calm, something far darker stirred. Miss Seraphine Marin could feel it in the way the afternoon sunlight dimmed when she entered, as though the room itself held its breath. Elowyn's voice, light and lilting, moved effortlessly from one topic to another. But each time Miss Marin steered the conversation toward the widow's previous husbands, a string of unfortunate men who had met untimely deaths. The slight tightening of Elowyn's grip on her teacup was unmistakable. It was the smallest of gestures, the briefest flicker of hesitation before Elowyn would glance toward the window, as if the answer to Miss Marin's question lay somewhere beyond the hedge, or beyond the years, hidden in plain sight, but just out of reach. "Oh dear, Alaric," Elowyn would sigh, her voice soft and unaffected. "Such a dreadful accident with that ladder. I told him, of course, not to go up there at night. Such a silly man. But that was Alaric, wasn't it?" A slight pause, and then she would continue. "And Clement, he never could resist salted herring. I'm afraid that poor soul's heart couldn't bear it, you know. He was always so stubborn." The words spilled from her like a practiced recital, each tragedy told with such casual grace, as though death were little more than a minor inconvenience. Miss Marple, ever the observer, recognized the pattern. A woman who could discuss her dead husbands, as one would recount the weather. It wasn't grief she was expressing, nor love, but a carefully rehearsed performance that deflected any deeper probing. Every word seemed to skirt the heart of the matter, deflecting suspicion as easily as one might flick a fly from their cup. By the time the conversation had drifted into trivialities, rhubarb chutney recipes and floral arrangements for the wedding, the widow's casual mention of the ceremony was so calm, so unremarkable, that Miss Marple almost missed its significance. "Oh, and of course we'll have to move the wedding up a bit," Elowen remarked, brushing a non-existent crumb from her sleeve with such practiced ease that Miss Marple barely noticed the shift in tone. "The vicar's diary fills up so quickly these days." There was no excitement in her voice, no blush of new love or youthful joy, only the quiet, measured assurance of someone for whom a fourth marriage was little more than a formality, another step on a well-worn path. Miss Marple, who had studied people for years, who had read between the lines of many a conversation, felt something cold stir within her. This wasn't love. It was something more precise, something far more calculated. Elowen Blythe, for all her softness and charm, was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't a widow mourning her losses. She was a woman who had learned to navigate grief as a means to an end. Miss Marple's smile remained polite, though it was strained beneath the weight of her growing certainty. Beneath the surface of the widow's every gesture was a plan, a rhythm timed to perfection, a rhythm that had seen husbands lost, fortunes inherited, and lives shifted like chess pieces on a board, all according to Elowen's careful choreography. There was no joy in her voice, no hesitation, no tenderness. It was all so deliberate. As Miss Marple left, the door closing softly behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just seen the rehearsed ending to a story she had already read many times before. Elowen was not a woman moved by passion. She was a woman who moved men, subtly with grace, and without anyone even noticing until it was far too late. The power of a woman who seems harmless is a dangerous thing, Miss Marple knew. People like Elowen, charming, compliant, the perfect wife, rarely attracted suspicion. But when the bodies piled up, and the inheritance came through, people would look back and wonder, and the truth would be buried so deeply in the fabric of her charm, that no one would ever connect the dots. That evening, as Miss Marple walked the familiar path home, her thoughts churned like a storm. She had seen Elowen's type before, women who never seemed to have any ill will, women who blended perfectly into the background of society's expectations, and yet beneath their placid facades, they held the most lethal of power, the power of being underestimated. These were the women whose movements were always calculated, whose tragedies always came just too conveniently to be dismissed as mere misfortune. They were never suspected because no one ever thought to look closely. 3 husbands gone, and the world had shrugged, offered pity, and moved on. Miss Marple stood at her gate, her fingers grazing the cold metal latch, and felt the full weight of Elowen's game settling over her. This wasn't about love, or even loss. This was about control, about following a path that led her precisely where she wanted to go, every time. And so when Traston Vale, tall, handsome and ever so slightly eager, arrived at Blythe Manor the next day, Miss Marple watched from her window, the pieces clicking into place with a clarity she couldn't ignore. Elowen greeted him with a smile so practiced, so perfectly timed, that Miss Marple felt a chill crawl up her spine. As the door closed behind them, the quiet of the evening seemed to deepen, and Miss Marple knew without a doubt that the game was already underway. Elowen Blythe was not merely a widow, not merely a woman with a tragic past. She was a master of her own narrative, a woman who knew exactly how to stay hidden in plain sight, and no one would ever suspect her hand, even when the blade was already in the dark. By the time they reached for the teapot, the conversation had shifted to a rather mundane recollection of a seaside holiday in Brighton, sunset walks, the taste of salt on the breeze, and the hum of distant laughter. But as the suitor reached for his cup, his hand faltered, the steady confidence in his fingers giving way to something strange, almost unnatural. For a split second, His grip slipped, and he coughed, a sharp, ragged sound that shattered the gentle flow of conversation. A moment later, he was slumped, his body lurching sideways, as his breath came in slow, labored gasps. The widow, her features schooled in a perfect mask of composure, let out a piercing scream, a shriek so high and so sudden, it seemed to carry with it the weight of years of practiced sorrow. It was not the cry of someone who had just witnessed another unexpected death, but the cry of a woman who had known, somewhere deep within her, that this moment would come. By the time the village doctor arrived, his horse galloping through the winding streets at breakneck speed, it was already far too late. Another man was gone, it seemed, in the presence of the widow, the village's whispered suspicions circling like vultures. Within hours, rumors spread faster than the wheels of the doctor's carriage could turn, each retelling more outrageous than the last. By tea time, the entire village was humming with suspicion, and by supper, it was already settled. The widow had done it again. "She's cursed," Mrs. Hartnell said, her voice edged with more excitement than dread, the thrill of scandal dancing in her eyes. "But clever," Mrs. Featherstone countered, her voice low and filled with admiration. "Always the same, charming them into marriage, and then off they go to the churchyard before the ink on the certificate is dry." Even the vicar, known for his sermons condemning gossip and idle tongues, couldn't mask the curiosity that flickered behind his stern demeanor. But Miss Marren, always the observer, remained quiet, her conclusions hidden behind a veil of neutrality. Village gossip, after all, was often more fantasy than fact. Yet within that web of embellished stories, she had learned to find the faintest thread of truth. What intrigued her most, however, was not the widow's tragic reputation or the village's hasty verdict, but the fleeting expression that crossed the widow's face as she gazed out from behind a half-drawn curtain, a look that betrayed something far deeper than sorrow, something that felt almost like recognition. Not a woman resigned to grief, but a woman who in that instant had come dangerously close to death herself. The next day, as the village argued fiercely about whether the widow should be hanged or simply shut away, Miss Marren visited the widow's house. The drawing room, once filled with the heavy evidence of tragedy, was eerily calm, save for the untouched tea tray left behind amidst the confusion. It was there, as she stood still, her eyes scanning the remnants of the scene, that Miss Marren spotted something curious, an unusual trace of lipstick on the rim of the wrong cup. The widow's cup, usually marked with a faint touch of coral rouge, was placed near the suitor's chair, while the cup the suitor had used, strangely absent of any mark, was nearest to the widow's own seat. A simple mistake perhaps, but Miss Marren's sharp mind began to turn. If the suitor had indeed drunk from the widow's cup, then the poison had not been meant for him at all. The intended victim, it seemed, was the widow herself. The village, in its haste to form conclusions, believed they knew the story, that the widow had dispatched another husband to the grave. But Miss Marren knew better. This was not a woman with blood on her hands. This was a woman who had become a target herself. Walking home, her mind unraveling the implications of what she had discovered, Miss Marren pieced together a chilling truth. Someone wanted the widow dead, not for money or love, but for secrets buried far deeper than any of her husband's graves. The widow, it seemed, was not the culprit but the victim of a much larger, far more dangerous game. Had the suitor been an opportunist, or was there someone else, someone who had quietly lingered at the edges of each of her marriages, biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? As Miss Marren paused before the churchyard gate, her eyes lingered on the row of graves, 3 husbands, now joined by the suitor's unmarked resting place. But there was something else hidden in that line of tombstones, something more insidious than a woman who courted misfortune. Miss Marren realized that the widow was but a pawn in a game, much darker than anyone had imagined. Someone had been playing the long game, setting her up for the fall. And as the widow's tragic history unfolded, it became painfully clear that the final chapter was far from written. Somewhere, behind the safe curtains of respectable homes, there was someone else pulling the strings, their hand already reaching for another cup. It was then, in the most unlikely of places, at the Green Gables Café, that Miss Marren overheard a name, Charlotte. As Miss Marple strolled through the village, The familiar cobblestone streets felt quieter than usual, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for the next drama to unfold. There was a certain hum of gossip in the village that day, an undercurrent of whispered speculation that seemed to hang around every corner. The return of Charlotte, the doctor's daughter, had stirred more than just curiosity. It had stirred something far deeper in the village's collective soul. Charlotte had left years ago, after her father's funeral, her face a mask of stone as she stood at the grave, her eyes never once meeting her stepmother's. Miss Marple had never forgotten that moment, the icy stillness of the girl who had watched her father's body lowered into the earth, with a gaze that spoke of cold, unspoken resentment. Now Charlotte had returned, but there was no fanfare, no public announcement. She had taken a quiet room above the post office, blending into the background of village life, as if she hadn't left at all. But villages, Miss Marple knew, had long memories, and the arrival of a woman with a past as tangled as Charlotte's never went unnoticed, especially not when it coincided so neatly with the latest tragedy at Travelin House. It was too perfect to be a coincidence. The widow's latest suitor had fallen dead, just as Charlotte appeared in the village again. The man had collapsed over his teacup, and now the widow's name was once again being spoken in hushed tones, the village's gossip machine already at full throttle. But Miss Marple's mind wasn't as easily swayed by the rush of sensationalism. She knew that people, especially the ones with the most to gain, rarely showed their cards openly. As she passed the butcher's wife, the vicar's housekeeper, and the elderly schoolmaster, she listened intently, letting their words fill the spaces of her thoughts, each piece of information clicking together like the subtle movement of chess pieces on a board. The more Miss Marple heard, the clearer the pattern became. Charlotte had never forgiven the widow, and that much was certain. The widow had stolen her father from her, not just his love, but his fortune, and his position in the village. Charlotte had been left to face the cold reality of her father's estate, stripped of any rightful claim, relegated to nothing more than a shadow in the house that should have been hers. Mrs. Penbury, the housekeeper, had told Miss Marple that Charlotte once whispered bitterly, "No woman marries 3 times, and calls it bad luck. The widow has a gift for widowhood." Miss Marple had seen enough of these bitter rehearsed lines to know they were more than idle chatter. They were a window into a deeper seething resentment. This wasn't just a passing irritation, this was a woman who had been burned by betrayal, and who would never forgive. It was a resentment that had simmered and festered, growing sharper over the years, until it took the form of a plan, and that plan had begun long before Charlotte's return to the village. Miss Marple had heard enough to know that Charlotte's life had been shaped by the loss of her father, a loss that had been compounded by the widow's cold indifference. The chemist's apprentice had confirmed the final detail that Miss Marple had been waiting for, the missing piece that made everything fall into place. Charlotte had trained in London's most prestigious pharmacy, learning the delicate art of mixing remedies, and not just remedies for the body, but for the soul, poisons, tinctures, liniments, and potions that could kill as easily as they could cure. The apprentice had been unaware of the weight his words carried when he mentioned that Charlotte had learned to mix poisons as easily as she had blended herbal remedies. And then, it hit her. The poison wasn't just an accident, nor was it a random event. It was the final act in a long-running play, carefully orchestrated with surgical precision. The widow's tea had been poisoned, but the poison had not been meant for the widow's latest suitor, as the village assumed. No, it was meant for the widow herself. Charlotte had returned not to bury her stepmother under another layer of scandal, but to finish what she had started long ago. The widow, who had charmed and married her way through 3 husbands, had now become the very thing Charlotte had always wanted her to be, an object of hatred and derision, a woman who was at the mercy of her own legacy. As Miss Marple sat in her quiet study that evening, her knitting abandoned on the table, the pieces of the puzzle began to form a chilling picture. Charlotte had returned not just for revenge, but with a singular purpose, to rid herself of the woman who had stolen everything from her, including the life she was meant to have. Charlotte's mind had been made up long ago. Her stepmother's death was inevitable, the final act in a play of bitterness and loss. The widow's death, so tragic to the village, was nothing more than the closing curtain of a drama that had been written years before. And Charlotte had played her part with the quiet, methodical grace of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Miss Marple knew now, as she had suspected all along, that the widow's downfall had been no accident. It had been carefully orchestrated, a quiet poison of revenge brewed in the shadows, with a daughter's vengeance as its sole ingredient. The village, ever eager to gossip, would never know the true story, that Charlotte had returned not just to watch her stepmother's scandal unfold, but to ensure it ended in the way she had always envisioned. As Miss Marple sat by her window that evening, the night air heavy with an oppressive stillness, her mind worked tirelessly to piece together the fragments of a story that had been unfolding in the shadows for years. Charlotte Trellian had always been a figure shrouded in mystery, her return to the village after so many years stirring up long-buried tensions. But it was the events surrounding the widow's third marriage that had finally caught Miss Marple's attention. The sudden deaths, the subtle whispers, the strange way in which tragedy seemed to follow the widow like a shadow. Yet, as the pieces clicked into place, it became clear that Charlotte was not just an innocent observer in this drama, she was its mastermind, and the widow was merely her pawn, a pawn in a game far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Miss Marple's sharp eyes had noticed the pattern long before anyone else, how each of the widow's husbands had almost predictably left behind a legacy, a bequest to a mysterious private trust. On the surface, this seemed no more than a peculiar legal oddity, until Miss Marple, with her characteristic patience, dug deeper. What she uncovered was chilling. Each of the widow's late husbands, men from vastly different walks of life, had left a portion of their estates to a trust with a name that meant nothing to anyone. Yet to Miss Marple, it stood out like a flashing beacon. With a few carefully placed inquiries and visits, Miss Marple discovered the unthinkable. The sole beneficiary of this trust was none other than Charlotte Trellian. The revelation sent a ripple of realization through Miss Marple's mind, for it explained everything, yet nothing at all. Why would Charlotte, the estranged daughter of the widow's third husband, be included in the wills of men she had no real connection to? Why had no one questioned these provisions, these generous bequests that seemed to follow a pattern far too deliberate to be a coincidence? The answer was as simple as it was horrifying. Charlotte had orchestrated it all. From the very start, she had been the unseen hand guiding her stepmother's marriages, subtly manipulating each man into including her in their legacies, ensuring that she would stand to benefit no matter the outcome. The widow, trapped in a web of her own making, became the subject of ever-growing suspicion and scandal, while Charlotte remained the quiet beneficiary of a plan that spanned decades. But this was not simply a case of greed. It was something far darker. It was a plan built on resentment, a bitterness that had festered for years, and Charlotte had never forgiven the widow for the life she had stolen from her. Her goal was not just financial gain. It was to see the widow suffer, to watch her live in the constant shadow of suspicion, her every action tainted by the dark cloud of impending doom. As each husband met his untimely end, Charlotte's grip on the widow's fortune grew tighter, and the widow herself became more and more isolated, surrounded by the whispers of the villagers, who saw her as nothing more than a serial widow, a woman cursed by her own choices. But Charlotte's ultimate plan was far more intricate. She had not just wanted to inherit the wealth, she wanted to ruin the widow's life, to make her a figure of scandal and dread, to see her every new love affair clouded by the expectation of death. And now, as Miss Marple sat alone in the quiet of her study, the full scope of Charlotte's scheme began to emerge in terrible clarity. It was not the widow who had been the true architect of the tragedies. It was Charlotte, who had carefully, and with chilling precision, woven a web of manipulation and betrayal that had stretched across years. In the end, it was not just about money, it was about control, and Charlotte had played the long game to perfection. What Miss Marple knew now was that this was not the story of a simple black widow, but of a woman whose ambition, manipulation, and bitterness had turned her stepmother's life into a tragedy of her own making. And in the shadows of this carefully crafted tale of deceit, Charlotte was finally ready to claim her prize, even as the final pieces of her dark legacy fell into place. Charlotte had orchestrated every move, carefully maneuvering the widow into each marriage, always ensuring that the vows were said swiftly after tragedy struck. She whispered subtle suggestions, nudging the suitors toward her stepmother's side, all while ensuring her own claim was secure with every union. Each new husband provided another step in her elaborate plan, one that saw Charlotte's name written into wills that had nothing to do with her directly, yet everything to do with her calculating influence. The brilliance lay not in immediate action, but in the silence of her method. No blood on her hands, no direct confrontation, just the manipulation of a world full of whispers, gossips, and the inevitable passing of time. Charlotte didn't need to act in the open. She simply needed to ensure that the widow, already tainted by a reputation she did not deserve, remained under the weight of suspicion. The whole village believed it was the widow's own charm that led to such tragic, untimely deaths. But in truth, it was Charlotte pulling the strings from the shadows, her quiet schemes hidden beneath layers of innocent gestures and well-timed advice. There was no rush, no frantic plotting. Charlotte's revenge was slow, deliberate, and cold. A quiet revenge that waited until the perfect moment, each marriage a step toward her ultimate goal, to make sure the widow would never escape the shadow of scandal. It wasn't greed that drove Charlotte. It was the sharp, slow burn of resentment, a deep-rooted bitterness that had festered for years. She didn't just want the inheritance. She wanted the widow to feel it every day, to see her life suffocated under the weight of accusations, all while Charlotte stood in the wings, her name appearing like a shadow in every will, untouched, yet always present. It wasn't until Miss Marple arrived, calm and determined, that the truth began to unfurl like a tapestry, long hidden in plain sight. With a quiet confidence, Miss Marple observed, and as the widow, exhausted and broken, confessed, a new picture emerged. It wasn't the tale of a heartless widow at all. It was the story of a woman loved by each man she married, and yet slowly destroyed by a quiet vengeance she never even saw coming. Each marriage had been tainted by a single thread of manipulation, a lie that grew like a poison, twisted so deeply into the fabric of her life that even the truth seemed impossible to find. Miss Marple sat, listening, as the widow admitted to the affair that started it all, a secret her first husband had hidden, a betrayal that ran deeper than anyone could have guessed. It was not just money that Charlotte had wanted. It was control, power over a life that could never truly be hers. And now, as the widow realized, it had all been a carefully woven plot, a story spun so well that no one could see the puppet master behind the curtain. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, the crack of thunder rumbling in the distance, almost like an echo of something more ominous. Inside the room, the widow's voice quivered, barely audible, but carrying the weight of years of quiet suffering. She spoke of Charlotte, the woman who had haunted her every step, a shadow that loomed larger with each passing year, each marriage, each death. She blamed me, the widow said softly, the words heavy with the years of guilt she had carried. Not her mother. She said I had ruined her family, taken her father, driven her mother to madness. I was just a girl, but I never forgot. Her hands trembled as they rested on the table, aged by the years of silent torment. She made sure I paid for it, the widow continued, her voice faltering, not all at once, but slowly, patiently, across a lifetime. Miss Marple, sitting silently, made no response, only the quiet acceptance of a truth that had been long buried. The weight of Charlotte's revenge had never been about immediate gratification. It had been a slow, methodical unraveling, a cruel thread pulled tighter over the years. The widow, now realizing it, finally spoke the truth she had buried for so long. I should have stopped it, she admitted, her voice breaking as the regret flooded back. I could have told someone. I could have exposed it all. But I didn't. Why? Because, Miss Marple, she whispered, I felt I deserved it. For the affair, for marrying her father, for being happy when her mother wasn't. I thought no one would believe me. I was afraid of what might happen if I said her name aloud. Miss Marple's gaze, gentle yet unyielding, never left her. Silence is a heavy burden, she said softly. The widow nodded, her face twisted with a bitter smile. It was easier to let her write the ending, she murmured. But it seems I was never the author of my own story. It was at that moment, a final shift in the room, that Miss Marple stood, her voice firm yet kind. "It's time for someone else to write the ending," she said. The scene shifted seamlessly, the room transforming from one of quiet confession to an ordinary, seemingly innocent gathering. One of those village teas where the chatter was light, the atmosphere deceptively calm. The usual crowd had assembled, Mrs. Tubb with her dense sponge, the vicar's wife with her impeccable seed cake, and Mrs. Featherstone with her over-the-top trifle. Charlotte stood at the table, her hands unnervingly still as she poured the tea, her demeanor cold, like a woman unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The widow sat by the window, pale but composed, her eyes searching for something unseen. Miss Marple sat at the center of it all, knitting, her actions measured and deliberate, as though she were the calm before the storm. The conversation swirled around trivial matters, the weather, market gossip, a scandal about a misdelivered letter, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of unease, something the village seemed to sense but no one spoke. This gathering was not about cakes or idle chat. Miss Marple had come with a purpose. She had come to tell a story, a tale that began with a young bride and a soldier's fall, a story laced with secrets, lies and poisons, one that had stretched across years, leading to graves, whispers, and a cup of tea poisoned beyond repair. And now, as the afternoon waned, the story was about to reach its inevitable, unmasking conclusion. As Miss Marple set her teacup down with a soft clink, the room fell into a sudden hush, the sound of the cup's delicate porcelain against the saucer more profound than any words could be. With no accusation, no flourish, just the quiet weight of her words, she began to speak. "A village remembers in pieces," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Fragments, a glance, a remark, a passing comment. Over time, these fragments weave together to create a story, whether that story is true or not." She spoke of the first husband's fall, of the rumors that had circulated after the second died, and the stormy night that had claimed the third. She talked of Charlotte's return, of wills quietly altered, and of a pattern that only revealed itself after years of looking from a distance. There was no rise in her tone, no dramatic flair, only the slow, unrelenting unfolding of truth, each piece of the puzzle placed carefully on the table. "So you see," Miss Marple concluded, her gaze steady, "the widow was not the author of this tragedy. She was simply the instrument. A woman whose only real crime was wanting to be happy." The room was still, each word sinking deep into the hearts of those present, the truth finally unveiled. As the widow sat, her past no longer her own, but a tale for others to rewrite. The room held its breath as Charlotte's trembling hands paused mid-motion, the teapot nearly slipping from her grasp, its contents spilling a silent warning into the teacups. For a long moment the silence hung heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, the kind that had festered for years beneath the surface of a carefully constructed life. Then, as if an invisible dam had broken, Charlotte's quiet sobs began to fill the space, her grief so profound it seemed to echo from the very walls. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice hoarse with a lifetime of repressed anguish. "She took everything. My father, my home, my mother's peace." She paused, choking on her words, as though each one carried the crushing weight of a childhood left in ruins. The affair, the whispered arguments, the cold, silent bitterness that had crept into their home like a disease. Her mother's heart so slowly being poisoned until the wedding, that rushed celebration that had twisted Charlotte's soul into something unrecognizable. She had stood there, just a girl, at the back of that church, hands clenched, her heart a furnace of helpless fury, watching a woman who could never be her mother's equal walk down the aisle, and take what was never hers to claim. "She was happy," Charlotte's voice broke, "while my mother withered away." The words spilled out in a rush, tangled in her own sorrow, for it had never been about vengeance, at least, not at first. But somewhere, in the wake of every stolen smile, every laughter that wasn't hers to hear, a plan had formed, slow, deliberate, insidious. "I wanted her to feel what my mother felt," Charlotte admitted, her eyes clouded with regret. But also something darker, deeper. The revenge had been hers to claim. But as time wore on, the toll it took had begun to wear on her as well. The guilt that gnawed at her now was a mere echo of the bitterness that had once driven her. Yet even now, she could not undo what had been done. The truth sat between them like an unseen specter. The gathering, once filled with idle chatter, had dissolved into a tense silence, with everyone retreating, their faces pale, the weight of Charlotte's confession pressing heavily upon them. No one spoke, but all knew the truth. They had all been living in the shadow of a lie that had been allowed to fester unchallenged for too long. Miss Marple, as she always did, observed in silence, her gaze piercing and understanding. As the villagers scattered, each carrying the heavy burden of Charlotte's words, Miss Marple herself walked home, alone. She paused at the churchyard gate, where 3 graves stood side by side, cold, silent, and final, each one a testament to lives unraveled by secrets, by love turned to bitterness, by vengeance that had consumed them all. The truth, she thought, was far more dangerous than the lies they had all lived, for Charlotte's tale was not one of murder, but of wounds that had never been healed, of hearts broken long before the first death had occurred. The pain of the past had been passed down through generations, an invisible thread that had woven its way into each of their lives, silently pulling the strings of their destinies. Miss Marple closed the gate softly behind her, her mind filled with a quiet understanding. Some stories, she knew, did not end with justice or triumph. Sometimes, the only ending that could be had was a simple truth, spoken aloud, and the heavy silence that followed it. Perhaps that, after all, was the only fitting conclusion. The final, unspoken truth was that the true danger had always been within them, the quiet festering wound that had never been addressed until it was too late.